The night my own son threw me out of my house, it was 38 degrees in Columbus, Ohio. I
I don't want
stood
to
on the
see you
front
ever
porch
again.
at 72
Please,
years
let me
old,
explain.
holding
Just
a
go.
single suitcase while rain
Please, I
soaked
had
my
nowhere
coat.
else to go.
My son Brian looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You've lived here long enough, Mom. This house belongs to me now." His wife, Melissa, stood behind him with her arms crossed, waiting for me to leave. I looked past them into the living room where my late husband's photographs had once stood. Then I quietly said, "Your father made sure this day would never happen." Brian laughed. He closed the door, but neither of them remembered who actually owned the house. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? Also let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are tonight. 6 years before my son threw me out of my own home, I buried my husband. Daniel Gibson had been my husband for 47 years. He was a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. He spent most of his life working as a civil engineer in Columbus, Ohio. He built bridges, supervised construction sites, and somehow still found time to fix every broken thing inside our house. The day he died from heart failure, I felt as if the foundation beneath my feet had collapsed. For months, I moved through our home like a ghost. His coffee mug stayed beside the sink. His reading glasses remained on his nightstand. His favorite chair sat untouched near the living room window. I simply couldn't bring myself to move anything. At 72, I had learned that grief wasn't loud. It was quiet. It followed you into empty rooms and sat beside you during dinner. For 6 years, I lived alone. I worked as a school secretary for more than 30 years before retiring. My pension was modest, but combined with Social Security and Daniel's retirement savings, I managed comfortably. The house was paid off years ago. The neighborhood was peaceful. I had my church, my garden, and my closest friend, Patricia Walker. Patricia lived only 15 minutes away. Every Thursday afternoon, we drank tea together. Every Sunday, we sat beside each other in church. She often asked me if I felt lonely. I always gave the same answer. Sometimes. The truth was that loneliness becomes familiar after enough years. Then Brian called. My son was 46 years old. He had always been intelligent and charming. Growing up, he could make people laugh in seconds. Daniel used to say Brian could sell snow during winter. But life had not gone the way Brian expected. He had changed jobs several times. His sales business had failed. He had accumulated debts that he rarely discussed. When he married Melissa 12 years earlier, I believed she would help stabilize him. She was organized, ambitious, and confident. At first, she seemed wonderful. She sent me birthday cards. She called me Mom. She invited me to dinners. But over the years, our conversations became less frequent. Everything changed one rainy afternoon when Brian called me. "Mom, can we come by tonight?" he asked. His voice sounded tired. Of course. When they arrived, both of them looked exhausted. Melissa's eyes were red. Brian sat at my kitchen table and stared down at his coffee. Finally, he said, "We're having some financial problems." I felt my heart sink. What kind of problems? The company downsized. Melissa's hours were cut. We're behind on payments. I looked at my son sitting across from me, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run through this house with scraped knees and dirty shoes. "How bad is it?" I asked. Brian rubbed his forehead. "We may lose the apartment." Melissa quickly added, "Just temporarily. We're working on things." The room became quiet. I looked around my kitchen, the same kitchen where Brian had eaten cereal before school, the same kitchen where Daniel taught him how to tie a necktie before prom. I didn't need much time to think. "You can stay here," I said. Brian looked up. "Really? This house has 3 bedrooms. No family of mine is going to be homeless." Melissa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Lauren. We won't be here long." I smiled. I don't care how long. That night, after they left, I stood in Daniel's old study. His photograph sat on the desk. I touched the frame. "Our boy needs us," I whispered. Several weeks later, Brian and Melissa moved in. At first, it felt wonderful. The house was alive again. There were voices in the kitchen, television sounds in the evening, laughter during dinner. Brian helped carry groceries. Melissa cooked several meals each week. For the first time in years, I didn't eat alone. One evening, we sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. Brian said, "Dad would have liked this." I nodded. He always wanted the family together. For a moment, I believed everything was exactly as Daniel would have wanted. But little things slowly began to change. Melissa started making comments about the house. "This place is huge for one person. The kitchen needs updating. People your age shouldn't have stairs." At first, I thought she was simply making conversation. Then she began measuring rooms. She browsed furniture catalogs. She asked about property taxes. One afternoon, she asked, "Have you ever thought about downsizing?" I smiled. "No, Daniel and I built our life here." She didn't answer. A week later, I noticed several family photographs missing from the living room shelves. The pictures of Daniel and me had been placed inside a cabinet. New decorative items sat where our memories once stood. When I asked about it, Melissa said, "I was just trying to modernize the space." Brian agreed with her. "The house does look nicer, Mom." I forced a smile. Perhaps I was being too sensitive. Perhaps I simply needed to adjust. One evening, I walked past the guest bedroom and overheard their voices. Melissa said quietly, "Eventually this will all be ours anyway." Brian answered, "Just give it time." I stopped walking. For several seconds, I stood frozen in the hallway. Eventually, the words stayed with me. I returned to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed. Daniel's photograph rested on my nightstand. I suddenly remembered something he once told me years ago. "If anything ever feels wrong, don't ignore it." At the time, I thought he was talking about strangers. I never imagined he might have meant family. The next morning, Brian brought me coffee. He smiled. He asked if I needed anything from the grocery store. He kissed my forehead. He was still my son, and yet something inside me had begun to feel uneasy. Not fear, not anger, just a quiet feeling that the house Daniel and I had built together was slowly changing, and somehow I was changing with it. I didn't know then that the small comments, the missing photographs, and the discussions behind closed doors were only the beginning. I still believed my son had come home because he needed his mother. I had no idea that one day he would stand in that same house and tell me it belonged to him. The first thing Melissa changed was the living room. At first it seemed harmless. She bought new pillows, replaced the curtains, and added decorative candles to the shelves. I told myself that younger people simply had different tastes. After all, Brian and Melissa were trying to rebuild their lives. I wanted them to feel comfortable, but comfort slowly became ownership. One Tuesday morning, I walked downstairs carrying my coffee and stopped in the middle of the room. Daniel's photograph was gone. The framed picture from our 40th anniversary, the one where he held my hand beside Lake Erie, had disappeared from the mantel. So had our wedding photo. I looked around. In their place stood decorative vases and a large metal sculpture. Melissa entered the room carrying laundry. "Oh, I moved those," she said casually. "Moved them where?" "Into the cabinet. The room looked a little crowded." I opened the cabinet. There they were, 20 years of family photographs stacked beside old magazines. I carefully picked up my wedding picture. My fingers trembled. I liked them where they were. Melissa smiled. I'm just trying to modernize the house. The house. Not your house. Not your parents' house. Just the house. That evening, Brian came home from work. I mentioned the photographs. He barely looked up from his phone. Melissa has a good eye for decorating, Mom. But those pictures meant something. They're still here. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that memories aren't decorations. But I stayed quiet. Over the next several weeks, more changes appeared. Daniel's recliner disappeared from the living room. Brian moved it into the basement. The old clock Daniel repaired himself was taken off the wall. Melissa painted the guest bedroom without asking me. New furniture arrived. Boxes filled the garage. Slowly, the house I had shared with my husband for nearly 50 years began to feel unfamiliar. One afternoon, I returned from church and found Melissa measuring the dining room. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked up. "Just seeing what would fit in here." "What do you mean?" "A larger dining table. Maybe an island in the kitchen, too." I laughed softly. "That's a lot of work." She shrugged. "This house has good bones." Something about the way she said it unsettled me. She sounded like a real estate agent discussing a property, not a daughter-in-law discussing her home. A few days later, Patricia came over for tea. She sat quietly in the kitchen. Finally, she said, "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy with them living here?" I stirred my tea. "Why would you ask that?" She hesitated. "I don't know. The atmosphere feels different." I smiled. "They've been through a difficult time." Patricia looked toward the living room. "I noticed Daniel's photographs." "So did I." She reached across the table. "Lauren, don't disappear inside your own home." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That evening, I walked through the house alone. The hallway seemed different. The bedroom smelled different. Even the kitchen no longer felt entirely mine. Yet I kept telling myself that families make adjustments. Families compromise. Families support each other. Then one Saturday morning, I heard Brian and Melissa talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. I had simply come downstairs earlier than usual. Melissa said, "We should start thinking long-term." Brian answered quietly, "Let's not talk about this now." "Why not? She's getting older." My footsteps stopped. Melissa continued, "The stairs aren't safe for her." Brian sighed. "I know. Maybe assisted living eventually." I felt cold. Not because of what she said, because of how casually she said it. As if I wasn't upstairs. As if I weren't still capable of hearing. As if my future had become a discussion between two people who had never asked me what I wanted. I walked into the kitchen. Both of them immediately stopped talking. Brian smiled. "Morning, Mom." I poured coffee. No one spoke. Finally, I said, "I'm still healthy." Melissa forced a smile. "Of course you are. But we worry about you." I looked directly at her. "I'll let you know when I need help." The room became quiet. Later that week, Brian asked me about the house itself. It seemed innocent. "When did Dad finish paying the mortgage?" "Oh, years ago." "Did he refinance?" "No." "Property taxes aren't too high, are they?" I looked at him. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Just curious." I wanted to believe him, but the questions kept coming. Insurance, utilities, home value, maintenance costs. One evening, Melissa sat beside me on the porch. "The housing market is incredible right now." I nodded politely. "Houses around here are selling quickly." "That's nice." She smiled. "This property must be worth a fortune." I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know exactly what the house was worth. Daniel had always handled those things, and honestly, I had never cared. It wasn't an investment, it was my home. A few days later, I walked into the garage and found several boxes. The labels read, Master Bedroom, Dining Room, Storage. I frowned. What's this? Melissa appeared behind me. Oh, I was organizing. I opened one box. Inside were some of Daniel's old books. Another contained family photo albums. Another held Christmas decorations. Items that had always belonged inside the house, not the garage. I carefully closed the lid. That night, I sat in Daniel's old study. Most of his things remained untouched there. His desk, his lamp, his fountain pen. I opened the top drawer. Inside sat a small note written years earlier. It was one of his reminders. It simply said, protect what matters. At the time, he had probably meant finances, insurance, retirement. But sitting alone in that quiet room, I suddenly wondered if he had meant something else. The following Sunday after church, I returned home earlier than expected. Brian and Melissa didn't hear me enter. Their voices came from the dining room. Melissa said, "Eventually, this will all belong to us anyway." Brian was silent. She continued, "We need to start thinking ahead." Brian finally answered, "Just give it time." I stood frozen. Eventually, give it time, not if, when. I quietly walked upstairs before they could see me. For nearly an hour, I sat on my bed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees Daniel had planted years ago. Inside, the house felt strangely unfamiliar. For the first time since Brian moved in, I began asking myself a question I didn't want to ask. Had my son come home because he needed me? Or had he come home because he wanted something else? I still didn't know the answer. But deep inside, a quiet warning had begun. And I could almost hear Daniel's voice. Pay attention. Something isn't right. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Sunday evening in early October. Brian had invited his cousin Mark and his wife to the house. Melissa had spent the entire afternoon cooking. The dining room table was covered with candles, expensive dishes, and decorations that I didn't even recognize. Most of my old table settings had disappeared months earlier. Melissa called the new arrangement more modern. I simply sat in my usual chair and tried to enjoy the evening. For the first hour, everything seemed pleasant. We talked about football. We talked about weather. Mark discussed his retirement plans. His wife asked me about my garden. I began to relax. Perhaps I had imagined the changes. Perhaps I had worried too much. Then Melissa brought out dessert. As she placed the pie on the table, she smiled and said, "We're all family here, so maybe this is the perfect time to discuss future plans." I looked up. Brian shifted slightly in his chair. Mark looked confused. "What kind of plans?" I asked. Melissa smiled. "Just practical things." She turned toward me. "Lauren, you've worked hard your whole life. You've earned the right to relax." I forced a smile. "I already am relaxed." She laughed softly. "No, I mean really relax. No more responsibilities, no more stress." Mark's wife nodded politely. Brian finally spoke. "Mom, we've been thinking." The moment he said those words, my stomach tightened. Whenever people begin a sentence with, "We've been thinking," it rarely ends well. Brian folded his hands. "You're 72 now." The room became quiet. "And you shouldn't have to worry about the house anymore." I looked directly at him. "I don't worry about the house." Melissa quickly added, Maintenance bills, repairs, insurance. That's a lot for someone your age. Someone your age. The phrase landed harder than I expected. For years, I had managed this house alone. I paid the bills, I handled the repairs, I scheduled maintenance, I took care of everything after Daniel died. Yet suddenly, I was being spoken about as though I could barely take care of myself. Mark tried changing the subject, but Melissa continued. Brian and I just want to help. I nodded slowly. Help with what exactly? Brian cleared his throat. Maybe we should start handling more of the household decisions. The word decisions caught my attention. What decisions? The house, finances, future plans. I looked around the table. Everyone seemed uncomfortable. Melissa reached for my hand. You deserve to enjoy your retirement. I gently pulled my hand away. I already do. Silence filled the room. Then Brian said something I still remember word for word. You've had your time, Mom. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even Melissa looked surprised. I stared at my son. My time. He seemed uncomfortable now. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He sighed. You and Dad had this house for decades. Eventually things change. The words hurt more than I wanted to admit. Because this wasn't simply a conversation about age. This wasn't even about the house. It felt as if my life had become something that needed to be transferred. Something old. Something finished. Mark finally spoke. Lauren looks pretty capable to me. I appreciated his kindness, but Brian laughed. You don't see her every day. I turned toward him. What does that mean? He rubbed his forehead. You forget things sometimes. I do not. You repeat stories. So does everyone. Melissa stepped in. We're just concerned. I looked directly at her. Concerned about what? Neither of them answered. After dinner, everyone left quickly. The house became quiet. I began washing dishes. Brian entered the kitchen. Mom, don't be upset. I continued washing. I wasn't upset until dinner. He leaned against the counter. We were only trying to help. By telling everyone I've had my time, he looked down. You're making too much of it. I dried my hands. No, Brian. I think perhaps I'm finally paying attention. He looked confused. What does that mean? It means things have changed. His voice became defensive. Melissa and I have done everything we can around here. And I appreciate that. Then why are you upset? I wanted to say many things. I wanted to ask why Daniel's photographs had disappeared. Why my belongings had been moved. Why conversations happened behind closed doors. Why my future seemed to be discussed without me. But instead, I simply said, I don't want to become a guest in my own home. Brian frowned. Nobody said that. No, nobody had to. He walked away without answering. Later that evening, I called Patricia. She listened quietly. Finally, she asked, Do you trust them? The question surprised me. Of course I trust Brian. But do you trust them? I looked around my bedroom. Daniel's photographs sat beside me. For the first time, I didn't answer immediately. I don't know. Patricia spoke gently. Lauren, sometimes people convince themselves they're helping when they're actually taking control. I thought about that long after we hung up. The following morning, I found several brochures on the kitchen counter. Retirement communities, senior living apartments, assisted living facilities. My hands began to shake. Melissa entered the room. Oh, those aren't necessarily for you. I looked at her. Then why are they in my kitchen? She hesitated. We were just exploring options. What options? In case you ever need them. I placed the brochures back on the counter. I haven't asked for them. She crossed her arms. You're being very defensive. No, I'm being very clear. For the first time since they moved in, tension filled the room openly. That afternoon, I went into Daniel's study. I sat in his old chair. I could almost hear his voice. Daniel had always been calm, practical. He believed in preparation. One evening years ago, after attending a funeral for a friend, he had said something strange. People change when money and property become involved. I laughed at the time. We trusted our son completely. Daniel had looked out the window and said, I hope Brian never gives us a reason to worry. I hadn't thought about those words in years. Now they returned to me. That night, Brian barely spoke during dinner. Melissa stayed on her phone. The warmth that once filled our home had disappeared. As I prepared for bed, I realized something painful. I was beginning to feel afraid inside my own house. Not because anyone had threatened me, not because anyone had yelled, but because I no longer understood what my son and his wife truly wanted. And for the first time, I began wondering whether Daniel had prepared for something I still didn't understand. 3 days after I found the brochures in my kitchen, Brian came home carrying a leather folder. I was sitting in the living room reading when he placed it carefully on the coffee table. Mom, can we talk? His voice sounded unusually calm. Melissa entered the room a moment later and sat beside him. Immediately, I felt nervous. The two of them rarely approached me together unless they had already discussed something privately. I closed my book. What is it? Brian pushed the folder toward me. Nothing serious. I looked down at the papers. What are these? Just some documents. Melissa smiled. Mostly for your protection. I opened the folder. Several pages had yellow tabs attached to them. There were places marked for signatures. Legal language covered nearly every page. My stomach tightened. I don't understand any of this. Brian leaned forward. It's just paperwork. What kind of paperwork? Medical decisions, financial matters, emergency situations. Melissa nodded. If something ever happened to you, we'd be able to help. I continued turning pages. Words like authority assets, representation, and property appeared repeatedly. The documents felt far more complicated than simple medical forms. I need time to read these. Brian sighed. Mom, it's standard. I still want to read them. Melissa crossed her arms. We're only trying to protect you. I looked at her. From what? Anything. I carefully closed the folder. I'll think about it. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Brian's smile disappeared. It's really not a big deal. Then it can wait. Melissa stood up. Most parents would appreciate having children who care. The comment hurt, because suddenly my hesitation had become ingratitude. After they left the room, I sat alone for nearly an hour. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an expert. But Daniel had spent his entire life teaching me one important lesson. Never sign anything you don't understand. That evening, I carried the folder upstairs. Inside my bedside drawer was an old address book. I opened it. One name immediately caught my eye. Richard Coleman, Daniel's attorney. Richard had handled our wills years earlier. He and Daniel had been friends for almost 30 years. I stared at the phone number. For a moment, I hesitated. Perhaps I was overreacting. Perhaps Brian truly wanted to help. But then I remembered the brochures, the conversations, the photographs, the missing furniture, the words, "You've had your time." I picked up the phone. Richard answered on the third ring. Richard Coleman. Richard, this is Lauren Gibson. There was a brief silence. Lauren, my goodness, how are you? His voice immediately brought comfort. We spoke for several minutes. Finally, I said, I need your advice. The next afternoon, I met him at his office downtown. The same office Daniel and I had visited many years earlier. Richard looked older now. His hair had turned completely white, but his eyes remained sharp. He greeted me warmly. It's good to see you, Lauren. We sat down. I placed the folder on his desk. Can you explain these to me? He adjusted his glasses and began reading. The room became quiet. Several minutes passed. His expression slowly changed. He removed his glasses. Who gave these to you? My son. And what exactly did he tell you? He said they were for my protection. Richard took a deep breath. Some of these are medical documents. My heart slowed slightly. But he looked directly at me. Others give broad financial authority. I swallowed. What does that mean? It means someone could act on your behalf regarding financial decisions. I felt cold. What kind of decisions? Banking, property matters, certain assets. I stared at him. Property? He nodded slowly. I could barely speak. Would signing these affect my house? Richard remained careful. It potentially could. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The office suddenly felt very quiet. Finally, I whispered, Why would Brian want this? Richard folded his hands. I can't answer that. I looked out the window. Cars moved below. People walked along the sidewalk. Meanwhile, my entire world seemed to shift. Richard spoke gently. Did Daniel ever discuss these matters with you? I shook my head. Not really. He stood up and walked toward a filing cabinet. After several moments, he returned carrying a thick file. My name appeared on the front. So did Daniel's. He sat down. There are some things we should review. I frowned. What things? Richard opened the file. Inside were documents I had not seen in years. Daniel's handwriting appeared on several pages. My husband had organized everything before he died. Insurance, retirement accounts, legal instructions, trust documents. My chest tightened. Why are you showing me this now? Richard looked at me carefully. Because Daniel wanted me to. I stared at him. What do you mean? He specifically instructed me that if you ever had concerns regarding the house or family matters, I should review everything with you. My heart began to race. Daniel said that... Richard nodded. He was a very thoughtful man. I suddenly remembered countless evenings when Daniel sat in this very office. At the time, I assumed he was simply organizing retirement paperwork. Apparently, he had been doing much more. Richard closed the file. Lauren, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What? Do you feel pressured? I hesitated. No. Then I thought carefully. The conversations, the brochures, the dinner, the papers, the expectations. Finally, I answered honestly. Maybe. He nodded. Then do not sign anything. A tear suddenly formed in my eye. Because for the first time in months, someone had spoken directly to me. Not about me, not for me, to me. When I arrived home that evening, Brian was waiting in the kitchen. Where were you? His question surprised me. Out. Melissa looked up from the table. Doing what? I met someone. Brian frowned. Who? I placed my purse on the counter. Richard Coleman. The room became silent. Melissa's face changed. Brian stared at me. Why? I wanted legal advice. His voice immediately became defensive. You don't trust us, I answered quietly. Your father always told me to ask questions. Brian stood up. Those papers were for your benefit. Then there shouldn't be any problem waiting. Melissa spoke sharply. We're trying to help you. I looked at both of them, and I'm trying to understand. Nobody spoke. For the first time since they moved into the house, I saw genuine anger in Brian's eyes. Not frustration, not disappointment. Anger. That frightened me more than anything, because I suddenly realized something. My refusal to sign those papers mattered far more to them than I had ever imagined. And somewhere inside Richard's office sat a file my husband had carefully prepared years earlier. A file containing answers I still didn't understand, but I was beginning to realize that Daniel had seen something coming long before I ever did. I barely slept after meeting Richard. The entire night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation from the past year. The missing photographs, the brochures, the papers, Brian's anger, Melissa's pressure, and most of all, Richard's words. Daniel wanted me to review everything with you. I kept asking myself the same question. What exactly had my husband prepared? The next morning, I returned to Richard's office. He had asked me to come alone. When I entered, a thick folder already sat on his desk. My name was written on one side, Daniel's on the other. Richard folded his hands. Before we begin, I want you to understand something. I nodded. Daniel loved you very much. My eyes immediately filled with tears. I know. He worried about what would happen after he was gone. I looked down at my hands. He never said anything. Richard smiled softly. He didn't want to frighten you. He opened the folder. Inside were documents, letters, and legal records. Some carried Daniel's signature. Others contained handwritten notes. Richard removed one document. This is the Gibson Family Trust. I frowned. The what? A trust your husband created 9 years ago. I stared at him. I don't remember signing this. You didn't need to. Daniel established it with his assets before transferring certain property. I felt embarrassed. Daniel had always handled legal matters. I trusted him completely. Richard slid the document toward me. The house is part of the trust. My heart skipped. The house? Yes. I looked up. Then who owns it? Richard answered calmly. The trust owns it. I struggled to understand. And what does that mean? It means the house isn't directly in Brian's name. My breathing slowed. It isn't. No. I stared at him. But Brian seems to believe. He may believe many things. Richard removed another page. Daniel named you as the primary trustee. I frowned. What exactly is a trustee? The person who controls the trust. My voice became quiet. Me? Yes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. All these years, I had believed the house simply belonged to Daniel and me. I never realized how carefully he had planned everything. Richard continued. After your death, Brian becomes the beneficiary. I nodded slowly. So, eventually, it becomes his. Possibly. That single word caught my attention. Possibly. Richard looked directly at me. There are conditions. I felt cold. What conditions? He opened another document. Several paragraphs had been highlighted. He read slowly. The beneficiary shall maintain respectful and supportive treatment toward the surviving spouse. I swallowed. He continued. Any act of coercion, intimidation, financial pressure, or removal of residence rights may result in the suspension of inheritance rights. I stared at him. What? Richard looked down at the document. Daniel was very specific. My heart began to race. He wrote this. Every word. Tears filled my eyes, because suddenly I could hear my husband's voice, calm, practical, protective. Richard continued reading. The surviving spouse shall retain unrestricted lifetime residency and full authority over the property. I covered my mouth. Daniel had protected me. Years before he died, years before Brian moved home, years before Melissa entered my kitchen carrying brochures. Richard carefully closed the document. Your husband worried that grief might make you vulnerable. I whispered. He knew. He hoped he was wrong. The room became silent. Finally, I asked the question that frightened me most. If Brian forces me out, Richard interrupted gently. He cannot. What if he tries? Legally, he has no authority. I felt dizzy. All these months, I had slowly begun believing that perhaps the house really would become theirs, that perhaps I should step aside, that perhaps I was becoming old. Instead, I was sitting inside a lawyer's office discovering that my husband had spent years ensuring exactly the opposite. Richard reached into the file again. There is something else. He handed me an envelope. Daniel's handwriting appeared across the front. For Lauren. My hands shook. I've never seen this. He instructed me to give it to you only if you ever doubted your own judgment. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. I immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. Lauren, if you're reading this, it means something doesn't feel right. Trust yourself. You have always been stronger than you believe. This house belongs to the life we built together. Never allow anyone to convince you that your age makes you powerless. If Brian becomes the man we hoped he would be, he will eventually inherit our home. If he forgets how to treat you, then he must learn. I love you, Daniel. By the time I finished reading, tears covered my face. Richard quietly handed me tissues. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, he knew. Richard nodded. He understood human nature. I folded the letter carefully. Should I tell Brian? Richard thought for a moment. Not yet. Why? Because right now you're still learning the truth. I looked down. And if Brian asked me to sign those papers again, his answer came immediately. Do not sign anything. That afternoon, I drove home slowly. The trees along the streets had begun changing colors. Autumn had arrived. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not fear, security. Daniel had not abandoned me. Even in death, he had protected me. When I entered the house, Melissa sat at the kitchen table. Where have you been? I removed my coat. Out. She looked irritated. You've been gone for hours. Before I could answer, Brian entered the room. His expression immediately changed. You went back to Richard. I nodded. He crossed his arms. Why? Because I wanted information. His voice became harder. About what? The house. The room became silent. Melissa looked at Brian. Brian looked at me. Finally, he said, "Mom, you don't need lawyers." I looked directly at him. "Your father trusted Richard." Brian sighed heavily. "Dad's gone." The word struck me. Perhaps he realized it immediately because his face changed. "I'm sorry," he said, "but the damage was done. Your father is gone." Maybe that was exactly what Brian had begun believing. That Daniel was gone. That his plans were gone. That his protection was gone. What Brian didn't realize was that his father was still very much present. Inside the trust. Inside the letter. Inside every decision he had made. That evening, I sat alone in Daniel's study. His letter rested in my lap. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid, but I was sad because I had discovered something heartbreaking. My husband had trusted our son enough to leave him an inheritance, but he had loved me enough to protect me from losing my home. And somehow, Daniel had seen a possibility that I never wanted to imagine. That one day, our son might forget who his mother was. What I still didn't know was how far Brian and Melissa were willing to go. But I was no longer facing them alone. Daniel had left me something far more valuable than a house. He had left me the truth. After I learned the truth about the trust, I began seeing my son differently. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't avoid it. For weeks, I carried Daniel's letter inside my purse. Sometimes I would read it before going to bed. Sometimes I would simply touch the envelope and remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't confused, I wasn't helpless, and I certainly wasn't imagining the changes happening inside my own home. But Brian and Melissa seemed to notice that something had changed in me. I stopped apologizing. I stopped explaining myself. And most importantly, I stopped discussing the papers. That made them nervous. One Monday morning, Melissa found me drinking coffee on the back porch. She sat beside me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "You seem distant lately." I looked out at the trees. "I'm just thinking." "About Richard." I turned toward her. "Why do you ask?" She smiled. "I think lawyers sometimes create problems." I took a sip of coffee. "Or they reveal them?" Her expression changed slightly. "I hope you don't think Brian and I are trying to hurt you." I answered honestly. "I don't know what to think anymore." She looked offended. "After everything we've done, what exactly have you done?" The question surprised both of us. Melissa crossed her arms. "We moved here to help." I nodded slowly. "At first, yes." "What does that mean?" I stood up. "It means I need some time." She didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. That evening, Brian came into my bedroom. He rarely entered without knocking. This time, he walked directly inside. "Melissa's upset." I looked up from my book. "I'm sorry to hear that." He sat in the chair near my window. "Why are you treating us differently?" I took a deep breath. "Why are you asking me to sign papers?" His face tightened. "We've already discussed that." "No. You've explained them." "That's different." He rubbed his forehead. "Mom, we're trying to plan for the future." My future. Our future. The words echoed inside my mind. Our future. Not yours. Not mine. Ours. I looked directly at him. "This house isn't your future, Brian." His jaw tightened. "You don't trust me." "I trust actions." He stood up. "You think Melissa is manipulating me?" I remained silent. Don't you? I finally answered. I think you're both making decisions about my life without me. He walked toward the door. Before leaving, he said something that frightened me. You don't understand how hard things are for us. The next morning, I discovered my car keys missing. I searched the kitchen, the living room, my bedroom. Nothing. Finally, I found Brian drinking coffee. Have you seen my keys? He hesitated. I put them away. I stared at him. Why? You shouldn't drive during the snow season. It's October. You've seemed distracted lately. I felt my heart pounding. Give me my keys. He sighed. I'm only worried. I walked closer. Brian. He slowly reached into his pocket. As he handed them to me, I realized something. He no longer spoke to me like a son. He spoke to me like a child. That afternoon, Patricia came to visit. We sat in the garden. For the first time, I told her everything. The trust, the papers, Daniel's letter, the conditions. She listened quietly. When I finished, she looked stunned. My God! I nodded. Daniel knew. She reached for my hand. He loved you. Tears filled my eyes. I don't know what's happening to Brian. Patricia remained silent for a moment. Then she said, maybe he's scared. Of what? Failure. I thought about that. Brian had lost jobs, accumulated debt, failed businesses. Perhaps he felt desperate, but desperation did not explain cruelty. Later that week, several family members called me. My niece, my cousin, an old family friend. The conversations sounded strangely similar. Brian says you've been forgetful. He says you're having trouble managing things. He worries about you. I felt sick. The stories were spreading. One afternoon, my cousin Linda asked gently, have you considered assisted living? I nearly dropped the phone. Why would you ask that? Brian said you've been struggling. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen. Struggling, forgetful, unable to manage. The picture being painted was clear, and it terrified me. Because if enough people believed it, perhaps Brian would begin believing it too. That evening, I confronted him. We were alone. Have you been telling people I'm losing my memory? His face changed immediately. No. Don't lie to me. He looked away. I've only expressed concern. What concern? You repeat yourself. So does everyone. You forget appointments. I forgot one appointment. He became frustrated. Why are you making this difficult? I stood up. Because this is my life. He raised his voice. We're trying to protect you. No. The word came out stronger than I intended. No, Brian. The room became silent. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, you don't get to decide when I become incapable. His face hardened. And you don't get to ignore reality. What reality? He pointed around the room. You're 72 years old. There it was again. My age. As if age itself were evidence. As if growing older meant surrendering authority. I quietly walked upstairs. My hands were shaking. Later that night, I overheard Brian and Melissa arguing. Their bedroom door wasn't fully closed. Melissa spoke first. She's changing, Brian answered quietly. Richard got into her head. No, someone warned her. Brian sighed. What do we do now? Melissa's answer chilled me. Pressure. I stopped breathing. Pressure. Not conversation. Not patience. Pressure. I quietly returned to my room. For the first time, I locked my bedroom door. The next morning, my bank called. A representative asked if someone named Brian Gibson had inquired about account information. My heart stopped. No, the representative apologized. He said he was helping you with finances. I thanked her and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply sat there. The trust, the papers, the phone calls, the stories, the pressure. Everything suddenly connected. Brian wasn't merely worried. He was preparing for something, and Melissa was helping him. That evening, I called Richard. I think things are getting worse. His voice became serious. Has he threatened you? No. Has he pressured you? I remembered the papers, the keys, the conversations, the bank. Yes. Richard was quiet. Then he said, document everything. What does that mean? Write dates, conversations, incidents. My stomach tightened. You think it could become serious? His answer came slowly. I think your husband wrote those conditions for a reason. After we hung up, I sat alone in Daniel's study. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The house felt colder than usual. For the first time in my life, I realized I was afraid of what my own son might become. And somewhere downstairs, Brian and Melissa were discussing their next move. What they didn't know was that Daniel had already prepared for them years ago. What I didn't know was how far they were willing to go. The night my son threw me out of my own house began quietly. That was the frightening part. There was no warning, no shouting, no broken dishes, only a silence that seemed to spread through every room. It was early December. Snow had fallen throughout the afternoon, leaving a thin layer of white across the neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed on nearby houses, but inside our home, nobody seemed interested in the holidays. Brian barely spoke during dinner. Melissa remained on her phone. I ate quietly and returned to my room. Around 9 o'clock, I heard raised voices downstairs. At first, I thought Brian and Melissa were arguing, but then I heard my own name. I slowly walked toward the staircase. Melissa was speaking. We can't keep doing this. Brian answered quietly. Lower your voice. No, she doesn't trust us. She went to Richard. She talks to Patricia. She's making us look like criminals. I stopped halfway down the stairs. Brian sighed heavily. What do you want me to do? Melissa answered immediately. Choose. The word echoed through the house. Choose. I stepped into the living room. Both of them looked up. What exactly are you choosing? I asked. Neither answered. Melissa stood first. We need to settle this. My heart began beating faster. Settle what? Brian rubbed his face. Mom, this situation isn't working anymore. I stared at him. What situation? You don't trust us. I took a deep breath. And you don't trust me. Melissa folded her arms. You're making everything difficult. I looked at her. By asking questions. She shook her head. By treating us like strangers. I almost laughed. Strangers. The people who had moved my husband's photographs. The people who called my relatives. The people who asked me to sign papers. The people who contacted my bank. I looked directly at Brian. What do you want from me? His answer came quietly. Peace. And what does peace look like? Neither spoke. Finally, Melissa said it. Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while. The room became silent. I thought I had misunderstood. What? She looked at Brian. He didn't look at me. Maybe some space would help. I felt cold. You want me to leave? Brian finally raised his eyes. Temporarily. This is my home, Melissa immediately answered. We all live here. I looked at my son. Brian. He stood up. His voice became louder. We can't keep living like this. Living like what? Being questioned, being treated like we're trying to hurt you. I felt tears forming. Because you are hurting me. He shook his head. No, you're doing this to yourself. The words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I saw not my son, but a tired, angry man standing in my living room. A man I barely recognized. I whispered, your father would be ashamed. Brian's face changed instantly. Don't do that. Don't do what? Don't use Dad against me. I'm not using him. Melissa interrupted. Daniel isn't here anymore. The room became completely silent. Something inside me broke. Because she was wrong. Daniel was here. In every wall, every photograph, every memory, every document inside Richard's office. But they didn't know that. Brian suddenly walked toward the front closet. He pulled out my suitcase. The same suitcase Daniel and I had used during our anniversary trip years ago. My heart stopped. Brian? He didn't answer. He carried the suitcase upstairs. I followed him. Brian, what are you doing? He entered my bedroom. He opened drawers. He removed clothing. At first, I couldn't move. I simply watched. Stop. He continued packing. Please stop. His hands trembled. I could see tears in his eyes, but he didn't stop. Melissa stood in the doorway. Nobody spoke. Finally, Brian said the words I will never forget. I need you to leave. I felt dizzy. This is my house. His face hardened. No. He pointed downstairs. This is my house now. The room became silent. For a moment, even Melissa looked shocked. Perhaps she never expected him to say it aloud. I looked directly at my son. Who told you that? He didn't answer. Brian. He picked up the suitcase. You need to go. Tears ran down my face. I wasn't crying because of the house. I was crying because I suddenly understood something. My son truly believed what he was saying. He believed the house belonged to him. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that I was simply standing in the way of his future. We walked downstairs. The front door opened. Cold air entered the house. Snow drifted across the porch. My suitcase landed outside. I looked at Brian one last time. His eyes were red, but he didn't stop. Melissa stood beside him. Neither moved. I stepped onto the porch. The cold immediately cut through my coat. I turned back toward the house. The same house Daniel and I had built. The same house where Brian took his first steps. The same house where we celebrated Christmas for decades. I looked at my son. Quietly, I said, your father made sure this day would never happen. Brian actually laughed. Dad's gone. I shook my head. No, Brian. You just forgot him. The door closed. The lock clicked. I stood outside in the snow, 72 years old, homeless, thrown out by my own son. For several minutes, I simply stood there. A neighbor's porch light turned on across the street. Cars passed. Snow continued falling. Then I reached into my coat pocket. My hands were shaking. I removed my phone. There was only one person I wanted to call. Richard answered immediately. Lauren. His voice alone almost made me cry. He threw me out. Silence. Then, "Are you safe?" "No. I'm coming." I looked back at the house. The lights still glowed inside. Brian and Melissa were probably talking. Perhaps they believed they had finally won. Perhaps they believed the house truly belonged to them now. What they didn't realize was that at that exact moment, Brian had done the one thing Daniel had specifically warned against. He had forced me from my own home. And somewhere inside Richard's office sat a document that would change everything. I sat on the front steps and waited. Snow covered my suitcase. The cold reached my bones. But strangely, I was no longer afraid. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was finally stronger than their lies. And my son had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Richard arrived 15 minutes later. I saw his headlights turn into the street while I was still sitting on the front steps. Snow had begun covering my shoes. My fingers felt numb. My suitcase sat beside me, nearly buried beneath white powder. When Richard stepped out of his car, his face immediately changed. "My God, Lauren!" I tried to stand. My legs shook. He quickly reached me. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head. No, but that wasn't entirely true. My heart felt as though it had broken into pieces. Richard picked up my suitcase. "You're not staying here tonight." I looked at the house one final time. The curtains remained closed. The lights were still on. Somewhere inside, my son and his wife were probably discussing what had just happened. Perhaps they believed I would stay with Patricia for a few days. Perhaps they expected me to return and apologize. Perhaps they thought fear would make me surrender. What they didn't understand was that the moment Brian locked that door, everything changed. Richard opened the passenger door. "Come on." As we drove away, I didn't look back. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard asked, "Did he physically touch you?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Did he tell you to leave?" I swallowed. "He said it was his house." Richard gripped the steering wheel. "He actually said that, yes." His jaw tightened. When we reached Patricia's home, every light inside was already on. Richard had called her. She opened the door before we even reached the porch. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes. "Oh, Lauren!" She wrapped her arms around me. For the first time that night, I began to cry. Not because I had lost my house, because I had lost my son. Patricia led me inside. A fire burned in the living room. She had prepared tea. A blanket waited on the sofa. Everything felt warm, safe, human. Richard sat across from us. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "Tell me exactly what happened." I described everything. The argument, Melissa's words, the suitcase, the front door, Brian saying the house belonged to him. Richard took notes. When I finished, he closed his notebook. "He violated the trust." Patricia looked confused. "What does that mean?" Richard folded his hands. "It means Daniel's conditions have been triggered." I looked at him. "What happens now?" He answered carefully. "Now we proceed properly." The word properly comforted me, because nothing about that night had felt proper. I had spent hours wondering if I should call Brian, apologize, explain, beg him, but hearing Richard speak reminded me that I had done nothing wrong. Patricia spoke quietly. "Will she lose the house?" Richard immediately shook his head. "No." I looked at him. "Not even temporarily." "Absolutely not." For the first time that evening, I felt myself breathe. Richard continued. The trust specifically protects your right to live there. I whispered, Daniel really thought of everything. He nodded. He loved you very much. After midnight, Richard prepared to leave. Before he did, he handed me his business card. Keep your phone with you. I nodded. If Brian contacts you, save every message. What if he apologizes? Richard paused. Listen carefully, but don't make promises. After he left, Patricia and I sat beside the fire. Outside, snow continued falling. She finally asked the question neither of us wanted to ask. What if he never changes? I looked into the flames. I don't know. Patricia reached for my hand. Do you hate him? The answer surprised me. No. Because I didn't. I was devastated. I was humiliated. I was heartbroken. But I still loved my son, and perhaps that hurt more than anything. The following morning, I woke up inside Patricia's guest room. For several seconds, I forgot where I was. Then, reality returned. I had been thrown out. I sat on the edge of the bed. My phone lay beside me. 3 missed calls. Brian. 2 text messages. The first said, Mom, please answer. The second, we need to talk. Nothing about being sorry. Nothing about coming home. Only talk. I showed the messages to Patricia. She frowned. He should be begging. I didn't answer. At 10 o'clock, Richard arrived. He carried a leather briefcase. His expression looked serious. I spoke with the trustee administrator this morning. I sat down. And the trust provisions are clear. Patricia poured coffee. Richard opened several documents. The moment Brian removed you from the property, he violated the inheritance conditions. I stared at him. Completely? Yes. My voice became small. He lost everything. Richard chose his words carefully. His future inheritance rights are now suspended. The room became silent. Patricia covered her mouth. I felt no satisfaction, only sadness, because Daniel had never wanted this. He had wanted Brian to become a good man. Instead, his own son had walked directly into the one mistake his father feared. Richard continued. I'll prepare a formal notice. What kind of notice? Notification of violation. I suddenly felt overwhelmed. This had become real, legal, official, no longer simply a family argument. My son had crossed a line that could not easily be erased. That afternoon, Brian called again. This time I answered. His voice sounded tired. Mom. I remained silent. Where are you? I'm safe. He exhaled heavily. You embarrassed us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I embarrassed you. Melissa's upset. Something inside me finally broke. Brian. Silence. Did you sleep in your own bed last night? He hesitated. Yes, I slept in someone else's home. His breathing became heavier. Mom, no. For the first time in my life, I interrupted my son. You threw me out. His voice softened. I was angry. You locked the door. Silence. Brian, your father would be heartbroken. He suddenly became defensive. Stop bringing Dad into this. I closed my eyes because he still didn't understand. His father was already involved. His father had been involved years before the trust, before the letter, before that snowy night. I quietly said, You don't know what you've done. He answered immediately, I know exactly what I've done. But he didn't. Not yet. After the call ended, Richard looked at me. What did he say? He thinks this is still an argument. Richard slowly nodded. Because he doesn't know. I looked up. When will he? Richard closed his briefcase. Soon. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Sunlight reflected across the yard. For the first time in 2 days, the world looked brighter. Meanwhile, across town, Brian and Melissa still sat inside the house. They believed they had won. They believed the house belonged to them. They believed I would eventually return and surrender. What they didn't know was that Daniel Gibson had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, and very soon the truth would walk through their front door. 3 days passed. 3 very long days. I stayed at Patricia's house while Richard prepared the legal documents. Outside, the snow slowly melted. Christmas decorations appeared throughout the neighborhood. People bought gifts, attended church events, and planned family dinners. Meanwhile, my family was falling apart. Brian called several times. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I didn't. Every conversation felt strange. He never apologized, not completely. Instead, he talked about stress, money, arguments, pressure, as if those things somehow explained locking his 72-year-old mother outside in the snow. One morning, Patricia placed breakfast in front of me. You look exhausted. I am. She sat across from me. What are you hoping for? The question surprised me. I don't know. Do you want Brian punished? I looked down at my coffee. No? Do you want him to lose the house? A painful smile crossed my face. He never had the house. Patricia reached for my hand. Then what do you want? I thought carefully. Finally, I answered. I want my son back. That afternoon, Richard called. I need you to come to my office. When I arrived, several documents sat on his desk. He adjusted his glasses. I've completed the violation notice. The words sounded official, cold, final. I sat down. What happens now? Richard folded his hands. Brian will be informed that his actions violated the trust. And then, the inheritance provision becomes suspended. I stared at the papers. What if he apologizes? He may. What if I forgive him? Richard spoke gently. Forgiveness and consequences are not always the same thing. I looked out the window. Daniel had written those conditions. Not Richard, not me. Daniel. My husband had trusted our son enough to leave him a future. But he had also understood something important. Character mattered. That evening, something unexpected happened. Patricia's phone rang. It was one of our neighbors. Her expression changed immediately. After hanging up, she looked at me. Brian and Melissa are having a party. I frowned. A party? She nodded. Several cars are parked outside your house. My stomach tightened. My house? Patricia squeezed my hand. Do you want to go see? I immediately shook my head. No. But later that night, curiosity became stronger. Around 8 o'clock, Patricia drove past the neighborhood. We parked across the street. Music came from inside. Lights filled the windows. Several unfamiliar cars lined the curb. I sat silently. The house looked beautiful. Christmas decorations glowed on the porch, the same porch where I had sat in the snow. A young couple walked inside carrying wine. Someone laughed. For a moment, I felt invisible, as if my entire life had been erased in 3 days. Patricia whispered, I'm sorry. Tears filled my eyes. Then something caught my attention. A woman stepped out of a car carrying folders. She wore a business coat. She looked professional. She entered the house. I frowned. Who is that? Patricia looked carefully. I think she's a realtor. A realtor. My heart immediately began racing. The next morning, Richard received a phone call. He called me immediately afterward. You need to hear this. What happened? Brian contacted a real estate agent. I closed my eyes. He did what? He apparently wants to discuss selling the property. I felt completely numb. He thinks he owns it. Richard's voice became serious. Apparently, he does. That afternoon, he learned the realtor's name, Emily Carter, one of the more respected agents in Columbus. Richard sighed. This may happen faster than I expected. The following day, something even stranger happened. Brian called. His voice sounded cheerful. Mom? I said nothing. I think we should move forward. What does that mean? We need to talk about the future. I felt cold. Our future? Yes. I remained silent. Then he said something that stunned me. The house is too large. I closed my eyes. Brian? We could sell it. My heart broke. Sell it. The house Daniel built. The house where our son grew up. The house I had been thrown out of only days earlier. I spoke quietly. You've already made plans. He hesitated. We've talked to someone. Of course they had. Emily Carter, the realtor. I asked, did you tell her the house belongs to you? His voice changed. Mom, eventually it does. Eventually, the same word I had overheard months earlier. I finally understood. Everything. The conversations, the measurements, the renovations, the pressure, the papers. Brian had convinced himself that the future had already arrived, and I was simply delaying it. That evening, Richard visited Patricia's house. He carried several files. I spoke with Emily Carter. I looked up. You did? He nodded. Professionally? And his expression remained calm. She requested ownership information. My pulse quickened. What happened? Richard almost smiled. She discovered Brian isn't listed. Patricia leaned forward. What did she say? She was confused. I whispered, because he doesn't own it. Exactly. Richard opened a folder. The property belongs to the Gibson Family Trust. I sat quietly. The truth was finally beginning to appear. And Brian still didn't know. The next afternoon, Emily herself called me. I almost didn't answer. Mrs. Gibson? Yes. My name is Emily Carter. Her voice sounded nervous. I apologize if I'm disturbing you. It's fine. She hesitated. I recently met with your son. I remained silent. He indicated he was the homeowner. My chest tightened, and I encountered some inconsistencies. I took a deep breath. The house belongs to a trust. She paused. That's what I discovered. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, she said softly, I think there may be some misunderstandings. I almost laughed. Misunderstandings. That was certainly one word for it. After the call ended, Richard looked at me. He still doesn't know. When will he? Richard closed the folder. Very soon. Outside, Christmas lights covered the streets. Church bells echoed in the distance. Families prepared for the holidays. Meanwhile, Brian sat inside my house, making plans to sell something that had never belonged to him. He believed he had won. He believed I had become powerless. He believed Daniel was gone. What he didn't understand was that every decision he made pushed him closer to the truth. And very soon, someone would walk through that front door carrying documents his father had signed years earlier. When that happened, my son would finally learn who actually owned the house. The truth arrived on a Thursday afternoon. It was cold outside. Clouds covered most of the sky, and Christmas was less than 2 weeks away. I was sitting in Patricia's kitchen when Richard called. "It's time?" For several seconds, I couldn't answer. "What happens now?" "I'm going to the house." I looked down at my hands. "Should I come?" He paused. "Only if you're ready." I thought about Brian. I thought about Daniel. I thought about the night I sat in the snow outside my own front door. "I'm coming." Richard picked me up 30 minutes later. Neither of us spoke very much during the drive. The neighborhood looked exactly as I remembered. Christmas wreaths, lights, children playing in front yards. Everything appeared normal, except my life. As we turned onto my street, I noticed Brian's truck in the driveway. Melissa's car sat beside it. The house looked beautiful. My house. Daniel's house. The house my son believed belonged to him. Richard parked along the curb. He picked up his briefcase. "Are you sure?" I nodded, but honestly, I wasn't. Part of me still hoped this would end differently. Part of me hoped Brian would open the door and say he was sorry. Part of me wanted my son back. Richard rang the bell. Several seconds passed. The door opened. Brian stood there. His face immediately changed. "Mom!" Then he saw Richard. Everything in his expression disappeared. "What is he doing here?" Richard remained calm. "May we come inside?" Brian looked confused. Melissa appeared behind him. Her face turned pale. "What is this?" Richard answered quietly. "This concerns the property." For several moments, nobody moved. Finally, Brian stepped aside. We entered the living room. My living room. The room looked different. More decorations, different furniture, Christmas ornaments. Yet somehow, it felt cold. Richard placed his briefcase on the coffee table. Brian crossed his arms. "What is this about?" Melissa sat beside him. Neither looked comfortable. Richard opened a folder. His voice remained professional. "Mr. Gibson, I represent the Gibson Family Trust." Brian frowned. "The what?" I watched his face. For the first time, I realized he truly didn't know. Richard continued. "The residence located at this address is held by the trust established by Daniel Gibson." Brian looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means the property is not owned by you." Silence. Complete silence. Melissa spoke first. "Excuse me." Richard removed several documents. "The trust maintains ownership." Brian shook his head. "No." Richard slid the papers across the table. "These are the recorded documents." Brian looked at them. His face slowly changed. "I don't understand." Richard continued. "Lauren Gibson serves as primary trustee." Brian looked at me. "What?" I said nothing. He looked back at Richard. "So, eventually it becomes mine." Richard answered carefully. "Potentially." Melissa leaned forward. "What does that mean?" Richard opened another document. "The inheritance rights are conditional." Brian stared. "Conditional." Richard read directly from the trust. The beneficiary shall maintain respectful treatment of the surviving spouse and shall not engage in coercion, intimidation, or removal of residency rights. The room became quiet. I watched Brian's face. He was beginning to understand. Melissa spoke. "That's ridiculous." Richard ignored her. On the evening of December 8th, Lauren Gibson was removed from the residence. Brian immediately stood up. "She left." My voice finally broke the silence. "No, Brian." He turned toward me. "You left." Richard opened another document. "As a result, the trust conditions have been violated." Melissa's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" Richard looked directly at Brian. "It means your inheritance rights are suspended." The words seemed to hang in the air. Brian stared at him. "No." Richard remained calm. "The violation notice has been filed." Brian looked at me. "Mom." I couldn't answer. Because I wasn't seeing a 46-year-old man. I was seeing my little boy. The boy who used to run into my arms after school. The boy Daniel taught to ride a bicycle. The boy who once cried because he didn't want me to leave him at kindergarten. And now he stood in front of me, realizing that he had destroyed his own future. Melissa suddenly stood up. "Wait a minute." She looked directly at Brian. "You told me the house was yours." Brian looked stunned. "I thought you said your father left it to you." He shook his head. "Eventually." Her voice became louder. "Eventually isn't now." Richard calmly closed the folder. "There is another matter." Nobody spoke. He looked directly at Brian. "The trust specifically states that the surviving spouse maintains lifetime residency rights." Brian swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means Lauren Gibson retains the legal right to occupy this residence." Melissa whispered, "Oh my God." For several moments, nobody moved. The entire room seemed frozen. Finally, Brian looked at me. "Mom." I could hear fear in his voice. Real fear. Not anger. Not frustration. Fear. I didn't know. Tears filled my eyes. "I know." Because I truly believed him. He hadn't known. But he had assumed. And assumptions had destroyed everything. Melissa sat down heavily. "So what happens now?" Richard answered. "That depends." Brian looked at him. "On what?" Richard turned toward me. "On Mrs. Gibson." Everyone looked at me. For the first time in months, nobody spoke for me. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody explained my feelings. The decision belonged to me. I looked around the room. The Christmas tree, the fireplace, Daniel's missing photographs, my son's frightened face, Melissa's shock. And suddenly, I realized something. I wasn't angry. I was simply tired, very tired. Brian's voice trembled. "Mom, I swear, I never meant—" I interrupted him. "You threw me out." He lowered his head. "I was angry." "You locked the door." His eyes filled with tears. "I know." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Brian asked the question he was finally afraid to ask. "Am I losing everything?" Richard answered before I could. "You already did." The room became silent once again. Because the truth had finally arrived. Daniel Gibson had protected his wife. His son had violated the trust. The inheritance was suspended, and the house that Brian believed belonged to him had never belonged to him at all. Outside snow began falling again. Inside, my son sat quietly on the couch. For the first time in years, he looked like a child. And for the first time since Daniel died, I felt his presence stronger than ever. Because even after death, my husband had walked back into our home, and he had protected me exactly as he promised. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute after Richard finished explaining the trust. The only sound in the room came from the Christmas music playing softly in the kitchen. Silent Night, of all songs. Brian sat on the couch staring at the documents. Melissa looked completely stunned. I remained in my chair, feeling strangely calm. For months, I had been afraid. Now I wasn't, because the truth was finally sitting in the middle of the room. Brian picked up the papers again. "This can't be right." Richard answered quietly, "It is." "My father never told me." "He wasn't required to." Brian looked at me. "You knew." I shook my head. "Not until recently." He looked shocked. "You didn't know either?" "No." For the first time, I saw genuine confusion in his eyes. The confident man who had spoken to real estate agents and discussed selling the house had disappeared. In his place sat a frightened son. Melissa suddenly stood up. "So all of this was a lie?" Brian looked at her. "No. You told me the house would be ours." "It was supposed to be," Richard calmly corrected him. "No. It was supposed to become yours eventually." Melissa folded her arms. "And now," Richard answered directly, "at the present time, Mrs. Gibson remains the sole authority regarding the property." The room became quiet again. I could almost feel Brian trying to understand what had happened. For months, he had acted like the future owner. In a single afternoon, that future had disappeared. Finally, he looked at me. "Mom." I waited. His voice broke. "I'm sorry." The words filled the room. For months, I had imagined hearing them. Yet now that they finally came, they didn't erase anything. I quietly asked, "For what?" He lowered his head. "Everything." I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But another part remembered the snow, the suitcase, the locked door. Melissa suddenly spoke. "Brian, why didn't you ask questions?" He looked at her. "I thought Dad left it to me." "You assumed." He became frustrated. "Because eventually it was mine." Richard spoke calmly. "Your father wanted it to become yours." Brian looked up. "What does that mean?" Richard opened the trust again. "Your father specifically wrote that inheritance depended upon how you treated your mother." Brian looked stunned. "He wrote that himself." Every word. I watched my son carefully, because in that moment he finally understood something. His father had not distrusted him. His father had simply understood human weakness, money, property, entitlement. Daniel had built protections not because he expected failure, but because he hoped to prevent it. Brian covered his face with his hands. "I failed him." Nobody answered, because the truth was painful. Melissa sat beside him. For the first time since this began, she seemed smaller, less confident, almost frightened. She looked at me. "I never wanted this." I looked at her quietly. "Then why did you ask me to leave?" Tears appeared in her eyes. I thought it would only be temporary. I remembered the suitcase, the snow, the locked door. Temporary. That word hurt almost as much as the action itself. Richard finally closed his briefcase. The legal issues are clear. Brian looked up. What happens now? Richard turned toward me. Lauren decides. The room became silent again. My decision. Not Richard's, not Brian's, mine. I looked around the living room. My husband's chair was gone. Our photographs were missing. The decorations belonged to someone else. The house itself suddenly felt unfamiliar, yet it was still my home. Brian spoke softly. Mom, please come home. The words should have made me happy. Instead, they made me sad. Because only a week earlier he had told me to leave. Now he wanted me back. Not because he suddenly remembered who I was, but because he had learned the truth. I stood slowly. I need time. Brian nodded. I understand. No, Brian. I looked directly at him. I don't think you do. Tears rolled down his face. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral. Seeing him cry now almost broke me. After Richard and I left the house, we sat inside his car. Snow had started falling again. He asked quietly, How are you? I stared through the windshield. I don't know. You don't have to decide today. I know. He waited. Finally, I said, I wanted him to love me, not the house. Richard remained silent, because there was nothing else to say. That evening, Patricia welcomed me home. She listened while I described everything. When I finished, she asked one question. Do you think he's sorry? I thought carefully. Yes. And I stared into the fire. I don't know if he's sorry because he lost the house or because he lost me. The next morning, Brian called. I answered. His voice sounded exhausted. I didn't sleep. Neither had I. He spoke quietly. I found Dad's old toolbox in the garage. I said nothing. He left notes inside. My heart skipped. Notes? He wrote dates on everything. That sounded exactly like Daniel. Brian's voice cracked. I forgot who he was. Tears filled my eyes. No, Brian. What? You forgot who you were. The line became silent. Finally, he whispered, Can I see you? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes. Part of me still hurt too deeply. Not yet. He accepted the answer. Before hanging up, he said something that surprised me. I took down the Christmas decorations. Why? This doesn't feel like Christmas. After the call ended, I walked outside. Snow covered Patricia's yard. The air felt cold but peaceful. For the first time in months, nobody was pressuring me. Nobody was making decisions for me. Nobody was discussing my future. I was simply Lauren Gibson, 72 years old, a widow, a mother, a woman who had survived the worst betrayal of her life. That afternoon, Richard called. I found something else. What? A second letter. My heart immediately raced. From Daniel? Yes. When was I supposed to receive it? He paused. If Brian ever violated the trust. I closed my eyes. Another letter. Another message from my husband. A message written years before. a message intended for the exact moment we were living now. And suddenly, I realized something. The greatest twist wasn't that Daniel had protected the house. It was that he had spent years trying to protect his son from becoming the very man he had now become. What that second letter contained, I still didn't know. But somehow, I felt that Daniel still had one final lesson left for all of us. Richard brought Daniel's second letter the following afternoon. The envelope looked older than the first one. My husband's handwriting covered the front. For Brian. My hands immediately began to shake. Patricia sat beside me. Richard remained quietly in his chair. For several moments, none of us spoke. Finally, I looked at Richard. "He wrote this for our son." Richard nodded. "He instructed me to deliver it only if the trust was violated." My chest tightened. Daniel had truly planned for everything. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. I immediately recognized my husband's handwriting. "Brian, if you are reading this letter, something has gone terribly wrong. First, understand this. I do not write these words because I expect you to fail. I write them because life changes people, and sometimes grief, money, fear, and disappointment become stronger than love. If you have hurt your mother, stop. If you have made her feel unwelcome, stop. If you believe this house belongs to you before it belongs to her, then you have forgotten everything I tried to teach you. This home was never a reward. It was never payment. It was never an entitlement. It was a place built through sacrifice, marriage, and love. Your mother gave up dreams for our family. She worked beside me. She protected you. She carried burdens you never saw. If you are reading this, you may have mistaken inheritance for ownership. You own nothing. You earn everything. Take care of your mother. And if you fail, then accept the consequences with humility. I love you, Dad." By the time I finished reading, tears covered my face. Patricia quietly wiped her own eyes. Richard remained silent. Finally, I whispered. He knew exactly what to say. Richard nodded. Daniel understood his son. I folded the letter carefully. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Richard asked gently, "Would you like Brian to read it?" I stared at the envelope. Yes. That evening, Brian called again. His voice sounded exhausted. "Mom," I took a deep breath. "There's something your father left for you." Silence. "What do you mean?" "He wrote you a letter." For several seconds, I heard nothing. Then, his voice broke. "A letter, yes." "When?" "Years ago." His breathing became unsteady. "Can I see it?" I looked at Richard. He nodded. "Tomorrow." The next afternoon, Brian arrived alone at Patricia's house. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He looked exhausted. His eyes were swollen. His beard had grown. For the first time in years, he seemed small. Very small. He entered quietly. Patricia offered coffee. He declined. Richard sat nearby. Nobody spoke. Finally, I handed him the envelope. His hands trembled. He looked at his father's handwriting. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he opened the letter. The room became completely silent. I watched my son's face as he read. Confusion, shock, pain, regret. At one point, he stopped reading and closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his face. When he finished, he sat motionless. No one interrupted him. Several minutes passed. Finally, he whispered. He knew. Richard answered softly. Your father understood people. Brian looked at me. I didn't want to become this person. I quietly asked, then why did you? He looked down. For a long time he said nothing. Finally, the truth came out. When I lost my job, I was scared. I listened. I had debt. His voice shook. I couldn't tell anyone. Tears continued falling. Melissa and I argued constantly. He looked up, and then I started thinking about the house. I remained silent. It felt like security. His hands trembled. At first, I told myself I was helping you. He lowered his head. But eventually, I started believing the house was already mine. Nobody spoke. Because this was the truth. Not greed alone, not evil, fear, failure, pride, entitlement, and slowly those things had become stronger than love. Brian looked at Richard. Did Dad really think I would do this? Richard answered carefully. No. Then why the trust? Because he hoped you wouldn't. Brian began crying openly. I disappointed him. I quietly said, You hurt him. He looked at me. Dad's dead. I shook my head. No, Brian. The room became silent. You hurt the man who trusted you enough to leave you everything. Those words seemed to break him. He covered his face. For several minutes, he cried. The little boy I once knew finally appeared again. Not the angry man, not the future homeowner, my son. Later, he spoke softly. Melissa left. I looked up. What? She went to her sister's house. I felt surprised. Why? He stared at the floor. She said she doesn't recognize me. Neither did I, but I didn't say that. Before leaving, Brian stood in front of me. His eyes were red. His voice trembled. Mom. I waited. If you never forgive me, I'll understand. Tears filled my eyes, because I had imagined this moment many times, the apology, the regret, the realization. Yet somehow, it still hurt. I quietly asked, Do you want the house? He immediately shook his head. No, not anymore. He looked at Daniel's letter. I don't deserve it. For the first time since all of this began, I believed him. After he left, Patricia looked at me. What are you thinking? I sat quietly. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Christmas lights glowed across the neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. Finally, I answered, I'm thinking that Daniel saved both of us. Patricia frowned. Both? I nodded. He protected me. I looked at the letter. And he gave Brian one final chance to become the man he was supposed to be. That evening, I returned to my house for the first time. Richard accompanied me. The rooms felt quiet, empty. The Christmas tree still stood. The decorations remained. But something had changed. The house no longer felt controlled by fear. It felt like home again. I walked into Daniel's study. I placed both letters on his desk. One for me, one for our son. 2 messages written years earlier. 2 people saved by a man who had understood love better than either of us. As I sat in his chair, I realized something. The real inheritance was never the house. It was the lesson Daniel left behind. And finally, after all the pain, Brian had begun to understand it. The week before Christmas, I finally moved back into my house. Richard insisted on accompanying me. Patricia came as well. Not because anyone expected trouble, but because none of us truly knew what would happen. Brian had spent several days staying with a friend after Melissa left to stay with her sister. The house had remained mostly empty. As I unlocked the front door, my hands trembled. This had been my home for nearly 50 years, yet somehow it felt unfamiliar. The air inside was cold. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, but the lights had been unplugged. The living room looked almost abandoned. Brian sat quietly at the kitchen table. He stood when he saw me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "Welcome home." Those words nearly broke me, because only 2 weeks earlier he had told me to leave. Now he stood inside my house as a guest. I walked slowly through the rooms. Daniel's photographs had been returned to the mantel. His chair had been moved back from the basement. Our wedding picture sat exactly where it had once been. I stopped in front of it. My fingers touched the frame. Brian stood behind me. "I put everything back." I nodded. "Thank you." That afternoon, Richard spoke privately with both of us. The trust remained unchanged. The inheritance remained suspended. The house remained under my control. Nothing would happen quickly. Nothing would happen automatically. For the first time, Brian understood that consequences do not disappear simply because someone apologizes. When Richard left, Brian and I sat alone in the kitchen. Outside, snow covered the yard. Inside, the clock on the wall quietly ticked. Finally, he spoke. "Are you going to make me leave?" I looked at him. The truth was difficult. "Yes." His eyes filled with disappointment, but not surprise. "I understand." I took a deep breath. "This isn't punishment." He remained silent. "You need to build your own life." His voice cracked. "I failed." Yes. The word hurt both of us. But failure isn't the end. He looked down. "I don't know where to go." For a moment, I saw not a 46-year-old man. I saw the frightened boy who once stood beside me on his first day of school. I quietly said, "Patricia's brother owns several apartments." Brian looked surprised. "He does. One is available." He stared at me. "You're helping me." I nodded. "I won't make you homeless." Tears immediately filled his eyes. "After what I did," I answered honestly, "I'm your mother." The following week, Brian moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't large. It wasn't beautiful. But it was his. For the first time in years, he would have to stand on his own. During those weeks, Melissa rarely called. Eventually, she asked to meet me. We met at a small coffee shop. She looked exhausted, older, sad. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry." I listened. "I let money become more important than people." Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought we were building a future." I quietly asked, "At my expense?" She lowered her head. "Yes." The honesty surprised me. She looked up. "I don't expect forgiveness." I thought about that, because forgiveness and trust are different things. "I appreciate your apology." She nodded. "I left Brian." I was surprised. Temporarily, she shook her head. I don't know. She stared into her coffee. He became someone I didn't recognize. I wanted to say that perhaps she had helped create that person, but I didn't, because blame no longer mattered. Consequences had already arrived. Several weeks later, Brian asked if we could meet. We sat inside a small diner not far from his apartment. He looked healthier. He had found work at a hardware store. The pay wasn't impressive, but it was honest. I started counseling. I looked at him. You did? He nodded. I needed help. For the first time in many months, I felt genuine hope. He reached into his jacket. I wrote something. He handed me several pages. A letter. Not to ask for the house. Not to discuss money. Not to change the trust. Simply a letter. I read it slowly. Mom, I spent years blaming everyone for my failures. I blamed employers, the economy, my marriage, my circumstances. Eventually, I blamed you. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that I deserved something I had not earned. Dad was right. I forgot who I was. I became angry because I was afraid. I became selfish because I was ashamed. You gave me a home when I needed one. I repaid you by making you feel unwanted. I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know that I finally understand what I did. Love, Brian. When I finished reading, I couldn't speak. The little boy Daniel and I raised had finally begun returning. Not because he lost the house, because he lost himself. As winter slowly passed, our relationship changed. We spoke weekly. Sometimes we had coffee. Sometimes we attended church. Sometimes we simply sat quietly. I did not restore the inheritance. Richard advised waiting. I agreed. Trust requires time. One evening, Brian visited my house. He stood beside Daniel's photograph. I wish you were here. I answered quietly. He is. Brian looked at me. I pointed toward the letters, the trust, the house, the lessons. He never really left. Tears appeared in Brian's eyes. He saved me. I nodded. Yes. Because that was the truth. Daniel had protected me, but he had also protected our son from becoming permanently lost. The consequences remained. The pain remained. But for the first time since the night I stood in the snow, I believed healing was possible. Not because everything had been fixed, but because my son had finally stopped asking for the house and started trying to become worthy of the family he almost destroyed. Spring arrived quietly. The snow disappeared. The trees outside my windows slowly turned green again. For the first time in nearly 2 years, my house felt peaceful. Not because everything had been repaired, not because the pain had vanished, but because truth had finally replaced fear. Every morning, I sat on the back porch with coffee. Daniel used to sit beside me. Sometimes I still spoke to him. Perhaps that sounds strange, but after 50 years of marriage, love doesn't disappear simply because someone dies. And during those difficult months, I often felt that Daniel had somehow remained beside me. His letters, his wisdom, his protection. He had saved me, but he had also saved our son. Brian continued working at the hardware store. The job wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't impressive, but something inside him had changed. For the first time in many years, he stopped looking for shortcuts. He paid his own rent. He managed his own bills. He attended counseling every week. Sometimes he called me afterward. Today, we talked about Dad. Or, today we talked about anger. Or, today we talked about shame. Each conversation brought him a little closer to the man Daniel had hoped he would become. One Saturday morning, Brian came to the house carrying a toolbox. Daniel's toolbox. He placed it on the kitchen table. I found this in the garage. I smiled. Your father loved that toolbox. Brian nodded. He wrote notes everywhere. He opened one drawer. Inside were measurements, dates, receipts, and small handwritten reminders. Typical Daniel. Brian picked up one folded piece of paper. Dad wrote this. I looked at it. The note simply said, "Take care of what matters before it's too late." Neither of us spoke, because the sentence meant different things now. Brian quietly said, I almost lost everything. I answered softly, No. He looked at me. You lost your way. He nodded. Over the next several months, something slowly returned to our family. Not trust. Trust takes time, but honesty. One afternoon, Melissa called me. She asked if we could meet. We sat together in a small park. She looked healthier, calmer. She had started working again. For several minutes, we simply watched children play nearby. Finally, she spoke. Brian changed. I nodded. He did. She looked down. I changed too. I didn't argue, because we both knew it was true. She continued. I was angry about money. She sighed. I was scared. That word again. Scared. Fear had damaged all of us. Fear of aging, fear of failure, fear of losing security, fear of being alone. Melissa looked at me. I helped create this. I answered honestly. Yes. Tears appeared in her eyes. But Brian made his own choices. She nodded. I know. Several months later, she and Brian slowly began speaking again. Not about the house, not about inheritance, not about money, simply about life. For the first time in years, their conversation sounded healthy. One evening, Brian sat beside me on the porch. The sunset painted the sky orange. Birds moved through the trees. The neighborhood felt peaceful. He looked at me. Do you still love me? The question surprised me. I turned toward him. Of course. Tears appeared in his eyes. Even after everything, I reached for his hand. Love and trust aren't the same thing. He nodded. I know. After several moments, he quietly asked the question both of us had avoided. What happens to the trust? I smiled slightly. There it is. He looked embarrassed. No, Mom, that's not what I mean. I know. He stared at the yard. I don't want the house anymore. I believed him, because the old Brian would have asked months earlier. This Brian waited. This Brian feared hurting me again. I answered honestly. Your father wanted you to have it. His eyes widened. What? He always did. Brian looked confused. But he wanted you to earn it. Tears immediately filled his eyes. I don't know if I can. I looked toward Daniel's favorite tree. Neither did your father. He stared at me. What do you mean? Your father wasn't born a good man. Brian listened carefully. He learned. I smiled softly. He made mistakes. He failed. He struggled. I looked at my son. The difference is that he took responsibility. Brian lowered his head. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "I want to become someone Dad would respect." I squeezed his hand. "Then begin there." Several weeks later, Richard visited the house. We sat together in Daniel's study, the same room where everything had begun. He looked around. "How are things?" I smiled. "Better." He nodded. "And the trust?" I thought carefully. "I won't change it." He seemed surprised. "Not yet." "Not yet." He smiled. Daniel would approve. I looked at my husband's photograph. Perhaps he would. Perhaps he already did. That Christmas, 1 year after the night I sat outside in the snow, our family gathered again. The tree stood in the same corner. Daniel's photograph rested above the fireplace. Patricia attended. Melissa came. Brian helped cook dinner. Nobody argued. Nobody discussed money. Nobody discussed the house. Before we ate, Brian stood up. His hands trembled. He looked at everyone. Then he looked at me. "I need to say something." The room became quiet. "A year ago, I forgot who my mother was." His voice broke. "I forgot who my father was." Tears filled his eyes. "And I forgot who I was." Nobody spoke. He continued. "My father protected my mother." He looked at Daniel's photograph. "And he saved me." When he sat down, silence filled the room. Not painful silence, healing silence, the kind that comes after truth. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the living room. Snow had started falling outside. Exactly 1 year earlier, I had stood outside these same walls. Cold, alone, heartbroken. Now I stood inside my home, safe, loved, at peace. I touched Daniel's photograph. You were right. The house had never been the inheritance. The inheritance was responsibility, humility, love, and the courage to become better after failure. My son had nearly lost everything, but in the end, he found something far more valuable. He found himself.